May be familiar with a number of recent debates between the renowned psychologist Jorden Peterson and the outspoken atheist and religious critic Sam Harris. Now, if you're not familiar with Harris, he's the fellow who recently ended his career by making the audacious claim that he could have cared less if Hunter Biden had corpses of children in his basement. Sam Harris still would have voted for Biden. He even went so far as to defend the deliberate censoring of the Hunter Biden laptop story in order to defeat Trump. So, while Harris has revealed the absurdity of his politics himself, it was Jorden Peterson who dismantled Harris's entire atheistic worldview, exposing it for the fraud that it actually is. We're going to analyze how Peterson systematically deconstructed Harris's secular ideology, and we'll see precisely why Peterson thinks a new Christian age may indeed be rising.
What worries me about your enterprise, Jorden, and the way in which you seem to be linking our rational project and our scientific project with religion is right here. There's a difference between, and magic is a decent analogy. There's a difference between, like, paradoxically, real magic is fake magic, and fake magic is real magic. The only real magic in the world produced by magicians is the fake magic, where the magician, like someone like Darren Brown, will tell you, actually, no, I can't read minds, and I did put the rabbit in the hat, and this is fake, but the surprise is that even knowing it's fake, you can't understand how this effect is being achieved. Whereas the fake magicians are the ones who are pretending to be real, who are hiding, who are not acknowledging the mechanics, the real mechanics behind what is in fact effective. You know, the illusion that the rabbit pops out of the hat. And what I worry with some of the way in which you discuss the power of story, the power of metaphor, and the religious anchoring there, is that the leverage and the utility can be had even while acknowledging the real mechanics of it. You know, the fakeness of the magic, right? And you seem to suspect that it can't. That takes all of the wind out of the sails.
Now, just to be clear here with regard to Harris's concern here, Sam Harris believes that science and religion are antithetical to one another. They both occupy fundamentally different domains of thought. And so for Harris, whenever Jorden Peterson defers to the theological, the mythological, or the narratival for explanations of reality, Peterson's explanations cease to be scientific and therefore fail to explain reality, since reality is ultimately known through scientific rationalism, which for Harris is the polar opposite of religion. Here's Peterson's response.
I'm not so sure what of it's fake and what of it isn't. Well, so I would say that I do consciously participate in the process that you described. But you see, I would also make the case, and this is certainly one of the things that we've been discussing, that you do it unconsciously. And let me make the case for that for a minute, because I've been thinking about it a lot, and I'd like to see your response. So I really read The Moral Landscape a lot, and I thought about it a lot, you know, and so this is what it looks like to me. So you make the proposition that we have to breach the gap between facts and values, because otherwise our values are left hanging unmoored, and that certainly brings about the danger of nihilism, but also a potential danger of swing to totalitarianism, something we agree about. I truly do believe that. Right. And then you perform an operation, a conceptual operation, and you say, surely we can all agree that, and then you outline a story about this woman who lives in this horrible country, who's basically just being starved and disease-ridden and tortured her whole life and having just a hell of a time of it, to put it in a phrase. And then you say, well, surely we can all agree that that's not good. And then you contrast that with, at least in principle, the sort of life that we would all like to have if we could choose the life that we have. And then you say, well, we could start with the proposition that we should move away from this terrible, hellish circumstance, and we should move towards this more ideal perspective. And you say, if we could only agree on that, then. And so, right. And so, like, so far so good. But there's a couple of things that go along with that are quite interesting. And so the first is that actually what you're claiming is that the highest moral good isn't existing in that better space. The highest moral good is acting in the manner that moves us from the hellish domain to the desirable domain. It seems to me to be implicit in your argument. So there's a pattern of behavior that constitutes the ethic.
So this is fascinating. Peterson makes an interesting distinction between place and process. So in terms of place, he says that there are two antithetical states of being, right? Which he describes metaphorically as heaven versus hell, or light versus darkness, or utopia versus dystopia. That represents the spectrum of place. But then he says there's the process by which we aspire to achieving those states of being. So there's the place we all want to go, and there's a place we all want to avoid, and then there's a process that gets us to the one or the other. And what Peterson notes is that Harris advocates this ethical notion that behaving rightly, ethically, involves living in such a way that helps to realize the heavenly state of being as opposed to the hellish one. Obviously, metaphorically speaking, Harris is an atheist. We know our actions are right if they help to realize a more blissful state of being rather than a horrific one.
Well, I would say that existing in that better space is good enough as well. So, I mean, there's the question of what it takes to move from where you are to someplace better, and then there's just the someplace that's better.
There's both of those. Well, but perhaps we could say, look, what's the ultimate hell? It might be existing in the hell that you described, but it also might be, this is something worse, I think. I think that participating in the process that brings about that hell is actually a hell that's even deeper than the hell. So it's an analogous argument. There's the state of being in a good state, but there's also the state of being that brings you to that good state, and then there's the state of being that's a terrible state, and the process that brings you to that terrible state. And one of the things that I've learned from the archetypal and religious texts that I've studied, as well as the philosophical texts, is that the process that transforms society into something approximating hell is a lower hell.
All right, so again, this is fascinating because what Peterson argued there, according to the religious texts he was studying, is that this process by which one achieves a heavenly or hellish state of being is itself participatory in that being. In other words, the process that leads to hell is itself a kind of hell. The behavior that ultimately sends one to hell is itself hellish, a lower hell as he referred to it. And the opposite, of course, is the case. Good behavior awakens heaven on earth. For example, God is called light in the Bible. 1 John says God is light. In him is no darkness at all. And then St. John, like the psalmist, goes on to describe one who keeps the law as walking in the light. So the essential point here is that being and behavior are inextricably linked. The state of being that our ethical behavior is leading us towards is manifested in that very ethical behavior.
Okay, so we want to separate out two things. We want to separate out these states of being and the process that brings them into being. And I do believe you do that in your work, because basically what you suggest is that the appropriate way to act ethically is to act in a manner that moves us away from hell and moves us towards a desirable state. Now, the thing is that as far as I'm concerned, there's a couple of things about that. The first thing is that I wouldn't say that that mode of acting is a fact. I would say it's a personality. And that what you're suggesting is that people embody the personality that moves society away from hell towards heaven, for lack of a better term. And the reason I make that argument is because I think that you recapitulate the essential Christian message precisely by doing that, because symbolically speaking, at least as far as I can understand, stripped of its of its metaphysical context, let's say, the purpose of positing the vision of the ideal human being, which, independent of the metaphysical context, is certainly what the symbol of Christ represents, is the mode of being that moves us most effectively from something approximating hell to something approximating heaven. And then part of that message is, and this is also something that's dead along the lines of what you're arguing, is that the best way to embody that is actually to live in truth. I mean, so because I would say that the fundamental Christian ethic, metaphysics accepted once again, is to act in love, which is to assume that being is acceptable and can be perfected, and to pursue that with truth, and that you should embody that. And then I would say that the purpose of the representation, we could call them metafictions or archetypal representations, is to show that in embodied format so that it can be imitated, rather than to transform it into something that's diluted in some sense to an abstract rationality. Because I don't think the abstract rationality in itself has enough flesh on it, so to speak, which is partly why in the Christian ethic there's an emphasis that the word, which is something roughly akin to rationality, has to be made flesh. It has to be enacted.
Now, there is so much there. But what I want to zero in on was that astonishing observation by Peterson when he looked at Harris and said, you, Sam Harris, you are actually recapitulating the essential message of Christianity. You have a heaven, you have a hell, a utopia and a dystopia, a call to an ethical life that leads us to heaven and turns away from that which leads to hell, a horrible state of being. And ultimately, how do we do that? Well, according to you, Sam Harris, by living in truth. You believe truth sets us free. Now, you have to understand what Peterson just did there. He showed for all to see that Sam Harris's worldview, far from being emancipated from myth and narrative, is actually grounded in its own myths and narratives. What Peterson does consciously through invoking religion, Harris does unconsciously with the mythologies and narratives that ground his own worldview. And it may come as a huge surprise for Harris, given his limited knowledge of metaphysics and theology, but no thinking person can escape such mythological and narratival frames of reference. Cultural anthropologists have argued in over a century of research that the way human society is ultimately bound together is through something known as the sacred. And the sacred is comprised of timeless myths and narratives that are considered absolute and unquestionable, and thereby provide the means by which we can have social order. Whether Sam Harris likes it or not, his entire worldview is every bit as rooted in mythological frames as is the Christian narrative he so desperately tries to distance himself from. But there's a profound difference. Whereas Harris relies solely on the scientifically rational for his ethical prescriptions, Christianity relies on a loving and redeeming relationship.